Historical Collections on the Digital Map is sponsored by LHRT and co-sponsored by ESLN, RAS, and ASLS. And without further ado, our presenters.
Hello, my name is Ryan Perry. I am the Digital Collections Librarian here at the Central New York Library Resources Council. And my co-presenter?
I'm Ivy Gawker. I'm Library Director at the Adirondack Experience.
So we're going to be starting out this panel discussion with a discussion of maps and how different repositories can be used in conjunction when presenting historical objects in different contexts. So first, discussion of this explosion of repository platforms. So over the past number of years, there have just been a ton of different platforms that have come out, and this wide variety has led to two different things. First of all, a temptation to just try them all on for size, to try using a different repository to for each project or for each work your project you're working on, and the other is this sense of decision paralysis, where you have so many options it's hard to choose which one you should commit to. So there are two broad categories for repository platforms. The first I see are these generalist platforms. These are the ones that are the jack of all trades, master of none. So they provide wide-ranging support for a broad variety of materials. Examples of these would be Content DM, Allendora, et cetera, et cetera. These are kind of the Leatherman multi-tools of the digital repository realm. So if you need a screwdriver, sometimes it can be a little difficult to use a little screwdriver that's included in your Leatherman. So there are also specialty platforms which are more closely adapted to serve specific needs. So these play to the strengths of specific content or formats. An example of this would be the oral history metadata synchronizer, which is a pretty awesome tool that will synchronize transcripts with oral histories. So that's very specific. You can't use that to display maps, for instance, but it's very good at what it does. So that's more like your traditional screwdriver to your Leatherman multi-tool. One of the solutions for how to navigate this is to use a generalist platform for your main repository and use specialized repositories as your discovery layers. So this gives you a number of advantages where you have one main home for your materials. Your materials are all in one place. You aren't splitting them out based on project or on format. And this also gives you multiple access points. So your materials can be found from different avenues, and really you're playing to the strengths of your different repository options. So when you're working with multiple repositories, there's two main ways you can do this. And the first is by duplicating your materials. So you're uploading all of your maps in one repository, then you're uploading them all in another, metadata, the actual image files, et cetera, et cetera. This allows you to take advantage of each repository's strengths. So you're able to say, upload the exact metadata and exact format that you need, and take advantage of all the specific display formats and stuff that those repositories offer. The problem with this, though, is that you're duplicating your metadata, and each time you do that, you need to adapt your metadata, you need to crosswalk it, you need to make some small tweaks to it. And you also need to maintain your metadata in multiple different repositories. You can see how they can get really complicated really fast. The other way to navigate this is to use that specialized repository as a discovery layer. So this is more another view of the same data. So you're uploading your materials once, you're uploading your digital objects once, and you're linking to that copy. So if you look at the graphics at the bottom of the slide, the duplicating materials, it's like making a copy of a book versus this is, showing that book in a different context, in a different viewer. In some respects, you're limited by the features of the original repository. And so that's one of the downsides of this. But the advantage is that you can work with a single set of metadata records. You're not having to go back and say more information comes to light where you know more about the date or the creator of the materials. You only have to change that one place. It will propagate throughout your system. I realize this is kind of high level, and abstract, but I promise as we get through our later slides, we'll kind of bring this back down to earth. So a couple of things to keep in mind when you're reusing your digital objects. Most repositories have a variety of tools available to export your metadata. One of the most common around the internet is an API, which is an application programming interface. This allows for pretty complex queries. You can take your data set and you can ask it all sorts of relatively complex questions and have that data come back out. And then another tool that's pretty common in the archives and historical collections material realm is OAI PMH. This stands for Open Archives Initiative Protocol for Metadata Harvesting. So that's kind of a mouthful. That's why they use the acronym. Essentially, this is allowing a data feed. So this is just like a publicly accessible feed of all the data that you're putting into these repositories. And then thirdly, there are often other mechanisms for pulling your data out. Content DM, for example, will allow you to export all of your metadata per collection as a TSV file, as a spreadsheet file. As you're looking through this process, you need to really think about having clean metadata, and then also if you're planning to go multiple places with your metadata, apply the most stringent or the most picky metadata standards initially, so that way you're not having to build that out later on in the process. And that's really the broad level of what we're talking about in this panel. I will turn it over to Ivy to guide us through her cataloging experience at the Adirondack Experience.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. So yeah, what Ryan was talking about is kind of the abstract level of how this works, but I'm going to present on a pretty specific case study of these ideas, in action. If you're not familiar, the Adirondack Experience is a museum that documents and explores the human history of the Adirondack Park in northern New York. I'm the director of the research library here, and as such, I'm caretaker of our huge map collection. We have 3,000 maps, roughly, that document the Adirondack region over the last 300 years. And these maps can vary in scale from a statewide map showing all of New York to a single map showing like an acre of land in great detail. So there's a huge range within our map collection. And these maps come from geographical surveys, they come from companies that operated in the park doing like forestry and mining, and they also come from the tourism industry, which is kind of a big driver up here now. So on the map that you can see on this slide, our museum is that little yellow circle that I added. That's not original to the historical map. And although this map is, more than 100 years old, it still gives you a pretty good idea of just how remote the Adirondack Experience is as a physical location. We're smack dab in the middle of the park. And so for this reason, it's kind of difficult for researchers to visit our library in person. The nearest airport is about 2 hours away. Lodging near the museum is pretty hard to find, especially during our peak season in the summer. And then in the off season, it's usually snowing here. So nobody wants to come unless they have a snowmobile. So for these reasons, it's been really important for us to get our map collections online so that researchers can actually use them remotely. But the caveat to this is that I am the single staff member in the library, and similarly, we have one IT staff member. So any project that we were going to undertake to share our map collections would have to be inexpensive and pretty easy to execute. Next slide, please. So we do already have an online database for our maps. And this is one of those generalist databases that Ryan was talking about. This is the Past Perfect database, and we use this for both our backend collection management and as our online public access portal. But I'm going to demonstrate now why this database, while it's very useful to our organization, it's just not up to the task of sharing map collections. So this is the catalog record for that same 1884 map that I showed you on the last slide. And it has the basic information about the map. It's all very helpful. And it has a little image also. So if you click on that map thumbnail on the upper left, you'll get an expanded view of the map. Next slide, please. And this is as big as it gets. So this is useful for identifying the map and getting a rough idea of the area that it covers, but you can't see any detail. And with maps, that's where the information is all in the visual detail. So if you're crafty, you might try to save this image onto your desktop and zoom into it. Next slide. But once you zoom in, this is what you get. It's just absolute mush, and it's totally useless. So in practice, the Past Perfect site gives our researchers some ability to know what maps we have, but they can't actually use the maps. Even if we have good digital images, we don't have a way to convey those to the users. As it is now, if a researcher wants to get a high resolution map image, they have to email me directly, and then I send them individual files. So this is obviously really frustrating for our researchers, time consuming for me, and it's just not how people expect to interact with historical information online. Next slide. So luckily, we recently received a 2-year grant from the Council on Library and Information Resources that funded the digitization of roughly half of our map collection. And this means that we finally have quality, high-resolution scans of our maps, but we obviously needed a better way to share these in our Past Perfect database. And so this is why we decided to contribute our map collections to the New York Heritage website. And if you're not familiar, New York Heritage is a consortium website that displays historical collections from all over the state. And it's kind of another one of those generalist platforms that Ryan was talking about. But even so, it offers much more sophisticated search functionality than our Past Perfect database did. And very crucially, it allows users to zoom in on the digital images. So what you're seeing here are just some examples of the kind of detail of information you can get because you can zoom in on these maps in New York Heritage. It's just beautiful. So sharing with New York Heritage did mean that we had to clean up and enhance our metadata to meet their standards, because most of the maps that we had been cataloging in the past, we were using in-house standards or even no standards at all. So the metadata was kind of a mess, and it didn't translate to other platforms in the way that we needed it to. So this was work we needed to do anyway to get our metadata clean. And the added benefit is that now, because of that effort, the maps are easier to search both in Past Perfect and in New York Heritage. Another thing about our Past Perfect database is that it's sort of a silo. If you have to know the Adirondack Experience Museum exists and go seek out our collections database. But sharing our maps on New York Heritage means that people who don't even know about us going into it might stumble upon our resources and find them useful. So it gives us access to a bigger audience. Next slide. So Ryan had talked about adding a discovery layer, and this is kind of the other side of that process he was talking about. So because New York Heritage is much more flexible than our Past Perfect database is, it allowed us to add this new discovery layer onto our map collections. We had never added latitude and longitude data to our catalog records, but that was one of the data points that New York Heritage allowed us to input. So we started plotting each map with that information. And doing so means that each of these maps themselves could be pinned onto a larger map of the Adirondack region. So this is the screenshot of the landing page for one of our map collections from the Emporium Forestry Company. And as you can see, we've embedded a Google map that displays a point for each of the maps in this collection. So this allows researchers to kind of visually search through our maps. If you're interested in the Old Forge area, you can see what maps kind of cover that region. And best of all, creating this embedded Google Map didn't really involve a whole lot of extra effort. Because we had cleaned up our metadata at the beginning of this process, we were able to just extract that information, feed it into Google Maps to create the map that you see here. So I didn't have to go in and hand code all of those points on the map. But I'm going to hand it off to Ryan to explain how that metadata extraction actually works.
Yeah, so this is where we're kind of we started up kind of theoretical, and we're going to hit the ground by the end of this. So as Ivy discussed, we have a discovery layer that we built to find a different way of displaying her maps from Content DM from New York Heritage. And this process I'm going to go over, I'm going to use examples from New York Heritage from Content DM, but the broad concepts could be applied to any repository that has metadata that can be extracted or exported. So this first, this view shows a little bit closer view of what kind of data is in the embedded map. And this metadata was pulled from their existing records in New York Heritage and reformatted and dumped into Google My Maps. So as you can see here, we pulled the title, the description, and a link to the object in New York Heritage. So that's linking back to the full object with all the metadata, the year, all that extra information that you would want. And at the top, there's a thumbnail image, a small image of the map. As you can see from this screenshot, it's not like, to Ivy's point earlier, it's not very clear. So you definitely would want to click through and see the map larger in the repository, but it gives you a sense of what you're going to see. And this process, I'm going to show you really briefly what it looks like to do. And it's really not that complicated. It just took a minute to figure out the process. So the first step is exporting your metadata. So you would, in the Content DM example, you would go in to the web administration and go to the export function, make sure you return your field names in the first record, and pull the TSV out. The next step is reformatting that larger export to fit those categories that I showed you in the previous slide, what it's displaying. So obviously it needs latitude and longitude in order to work, in order to have that point. The name is going to be the title from New York Heritage. Description is going to be the description of New York Heritage. The URL is a reference URL from Content DM, and this last field is the photo. You kind of need to splice a couple of different fields together in order to get this. So there's a little bit of cleanup that can be done. I did make a template that works for New York Heritage materials where you just dump in the export and it'll spit out all this exactly how you would want it to do the next step. So the next step is exporting the CSV. So pulling the CSV back down from Google Sheets if you choose to use Google Sheets. Or if you're using Excel, you can just save it as a CSV file from Excel. So my template that I created is in the bottom corner. You can specify which data collection you want out of your New York Heritage export, and you just click this link and it will download the CSV for you. Otherwise, you have to go through the menu. The next step is crucial in order to get that thumbnail embedded in the record in Google My Maps. So you need to go to this third-party tool, which I found called GPS Visualizer, and they have a tool for converting these CSV files into what's called a KML or a KMZ file, depending on where it is. I don't know why they use two different names for this file format. But it's really simple. You upload your spreadsheet, you create the KML file, and then you take that KML file and put it in Google My Maps. Google My Maps is built on Google Maps, but it's like the personalized. You can build your own maps. You can make routes. You can do all sorts of things. But one of the really cool things is you can just import data that exists already. So that's what you're doing here. You import the data, and then you select the file, select that CSV, or sorry, the KML, KMZ file that you exported. And if you want to make any aesthetic changes, you can change the base map, you can change the color of the pins, et cetera, et cetera. And then really the final step is exporting the HTML. So if you go to one of the menus in Google Maps, you can embed in my site and then just copy and paste this HTML. If you're in New York Heritage, you can send that to your liaison, your council, library council representative, and they can add it to your landing page. You can also add this to your own website. You can add it wherever HTML is usable. So it's really can be used broadly in a lot of different places. And I'll turn it back over to Ivy.
All right, so yeah, this is a relatively simple way to get your existing metadata to work a little harder for you. Obviously, the ultimate dream is to georectify each map, and that's where you're layering your historical map on top of the contemporary Google map, so you get a sort of one-to-one matchup of information. But until we get there, my museum doesn't have the technical chops it's going to take to do that right now. So in the meantime, this still allows us to sort of show the coverage area for each map in our collection. And this is pretty important when you're talking about the Adirondack Park, because this park is 6 million acres and it's all pretty sparsely populated. So many of these historical maps use location names that are outdated, that nobody's using anymore, which makes keyword searching pretty difficult. And also a lot of it is just a wilderness where there aren't necessarily place names that help you sort of navigate the space. So for us, adding any kind of visual search function is a big win for our users. And now that we have this solid, strict metadata, we can look to doing more with it in the future. So I use this 1829 map of Hamilton County as a kind of metaphor for this point, because as you see, in 1829, there were still big blank spaces on the map. And this is because, the European American settlers who lived downstate just hadn't come up here and spent time here enough to know what this whole area encompassed. And I kind of think of us as working in the same way, like we're filling in the blank spaces as we go, and building on past efforts so that we can get toward a future where we have more accurate and meaningful information that we're sharing. So like I said, our project is fairly humble, and there's a lot more you can do with digital maps and historical data. And so I'm going to turn it over to Julia Carice, who will talk about HistoryForge, a project out of Ithaca.
Okay, thanks Ryan and Ivy. So my name is Julia Carice, and I am the Metadata Operations Librarian for Cornell University. Ryan and Ivy just gave a great overview of how you can use metadata to align historical maps with Google Maps. And today I'm going to talk about HistoryForge, which takes this process a few steps further to align not only maps, but also historical data so that it can be searched and visualized using geolocation data. So what is HistoryForge? HistoryForge is a project from the History Center of Tompkins County. It combines historical maps and photos with census records of the people who lived in Ithaca, New York, which creates a unique way to visualize the history of the Ithaca community in the early 1900s. HistoryForge was developed in 2014 by David Ferber, a systems analyst and web developer from Gorges in Ithaca, and Bob Kibbe, the former map and geospatial librarian at Cornell. In 2019, the History Center in Tompkins County received a 2-year grant from the National Historic Public Records Commission to expand the project, both locally and with partner organizations, and hired project coordinator Eve Snyder. Eve is coordinating both the volunteer training and the digitization of historical materials to support the project. I also joined the project as a metadata consultant for the grant in 2019 to help develop guidelines for metadata collection and a digital preservation plan for the data sets and objects being digitized for the expansion of HistoryForge. And I'll talk a bit about those additional materials later in this presentation. The project will continue to be intensively developed through 2021, but should be ready for partners to adopt later this month. The software and documentation developed as part of this project will be available on GitHub this year as well. So what does HistoryForge do? Why do we call this a community building project? It engages volunteers in its historical data collection and makes historical maps vibrant and interactive. I'll elaborate more on how HistoryForge accomplishes both of these things in just a minute. HistoryForge is also unique in the way that it presents its collected data geographically. In this way, it promotes individual and family histories by allowing searching by name and locations. With its focus on location, it also celebrates the built environment in neighborhoods, from businesses to homes, and is able to show and track change over time. And its rich collection of census data also allows for exploration of historical demographics with neighborhoods. Age, gender, ethnicity, and even unemployment data were collected in the federal census, and this information can be used to explore the demographics of neighborhoods in Ithaca over time. So HistoryForge is dependent on its community of volunteers working on the project. The volunteers play a very important role as they are the source of the transcribed census data that forms the data backbone for the project. Volunteers of all ages have participated in the project, and the History Center has hosted Saturday transcription days twice a month since the project began in 2014. It's important to remember that managing volunteers requires work to recruit, train, and keep engaged in the project. There have been some recent challenges to the crowdsourced work that the volunteers have been contributing to the project, and those include the introduction of the 1940 census. New information collected in 1940 started happening because of the Great Depression, and that included income and unemployment status. This required new fields in the volunteer transcription forms and additional training for experienced volunteers. There were also some changes because of COVID-19. Of course, all the in-person transcription classes were no longer possible, but Saturday transcription sessions eventually resumed on Zoom and made good use of breakout rooms to give volunteers individual attention as they needed it. Some transcription volunteers were lost because of the new online format, but the History Center saw that they gained just as many from the new online format. So let's take a closer look at the crowdsourced transcription work of census records that the volunteers provide for HistoryForge. Here's an image of a digitized census record available online. You can find digitized census records in a few places. They're on Ancestry.com, which requires a paid account. They're also on FamilySearch.org, which is a free website, but it does require you create an account for it. And you can also find them on Heritage Quest, which is a paid website, but Heritage Quest is available through most public libraries. They also all have slightly different interfaces. The History Center tends to use Family Search, but many transcribers have Ancestry accounts and prefer to use that site. The 1880 and 1940 censuses are also available on the National Archives and Record Administration website for free. Some transcribers work directly from the website, and others use pages that were downloaded and printed out, or now they work with the work turning remote, their emailed attachments. So volunteers interact with a form developed for the HistoryForge website, created to specifically address the fields for that year's census. For example, the 1940 census would have additional fields addressing unemployment status, which was not collected in earlier forms. One of the key pieces of information collected in the census data is the address, which becomes the connecting information between people and buildings in HistoryForge. The other key component of the HistoryForge project are digitized maps. For this project, Sanborn Fire Insurance maps were chosen because of their level of detail, but you can use any historical map with enough detail to show the city at a building level. Many contemporary maps or aerial photographs also have a great amount of detail and could be used for a similar project. So where did all these digitized maps come from? Some maps were digitized by Bob Kibbe using scanning equipment at Cornell. Other Sanborn maps were digitized and made available by the Library of Congress. One thing that's important to know about digitizing maps, don't think that just because they're old, they're out of copyright. While maps published prior to 1925 would be in the public domain, any maps published post-1925 do require a more in-depth look at their copyright status. So maps from 1925 to 1963 might also be in the public domain if they were published without copyright notice or if their copyright was not renewed. If the maps are being published online in the context of research and educational use, there's also a strong fair use argument that can be made for their inclusion in a project like HistoryForge. Copyright is something to consider before undergoing the time and expense of any digitization project, including maps, photographs, or city directories. But let's move on to the fun stuff, which is putting the historical maps to use through georectification, which Ivy mentioned earlier. Georectification is the process of taking an image of a map and referencing it to a spatial grid so that the image of the map can be used as a layer in other maps, or so that the image of the map can in turn be used for associated points of interest within the spatial grid. For instance, once this map of Ithaca is georectified, we can then use the map to find the latitudes and longitudes of the buildings on the map. In the case of HistoryForge, the digitized map was uploaded and georectified on the website using MapWarper. MapWarper is a free-to-use open source MapWarper/map georectifier and image georeferencer tool for individual and small groups, and you can find it at mapwarper.net. Once the maps have been georectified, a map layer can be created using a mosaic of historic maps on the HistoryForge website. The website allows you to zoom in and out of any of the maps, and the transparency slider allows you to fade the display in and out between the historical maps and Google Maps. I mentioned earlier that the address from the census records is the connective tissue that allows for the associations to be made between the buildings and the people documented as part of HistoryForge. Here, the building information from 1910 is displayed on a historical map from the same period. The maps are uploaded to the HistoryForge website and supercharged by overlaying them on Google Maps and then making each building findable by associating it with a street address. Selecting a building will return information about the building and the people who lived there in 1910. So let's see this in action. Here is a building record for Cascadilla Hall in Ithaca, located at 1 Cascadilla Place. You can see on the right-hand side the image of the building from the 1898 Sanborn Fire Insurance Map and information from the 1900 census. I'm pointing to the transparency bar here, and by sliding it to the left, it allows you to see the address on a Google map. The address also connects the residents to the location via the census records. Selecting any of these people will allow you to see any additional information available about them, either through census records or other associated information. One of these names looks a little familiar, so let's take a closer look. And here's the record for a person in HistoryForge. All of the details available from the census record can be seen on this screen. We can see that this William Strunk was a professor, which gives us a clue on why his name sounded a little familiar. This is the same William Strunk Jr. that wrote the Elements of Style for his students at Cornell University in 1918, of which the revised version by his former student E.B. White was published in the 50s and went on to sell over 10 million copies. The reason we're able to match his name, William Strunk, up to the correct record in HistoryForge is part of the important background work done on HistoryForge with validation. There is the ability to create internal authority records within the database, and this is not public-facing. This can clear up conflicts between similar names on multiple censuses. The hope is to one day to be able to use linked data to match up person records to online authority files. However, most people records, unlike William Strunk, do not have existing authority records in the Library of Congress name authority file or the virtual international authority file, so the creation of an internal authority system was necessary for HistoryForge. While right now the bulk of HistoryForge records are made up of census records, the website has limitless potential for other types of historical information to add to its people or building records. City directories can be used to enhance information in both of these areas. Information about places of employment, business names, and more accurate person names are all places we can look to enhance records. City directories have also been mostly published in type, allowing OCR, or optical character recognition, to be used for transcription of these records instead of the hand transcription that the census records require. The History Center of Tompkins County has a collection of Ithaca city directories from 1864 to 1989 they hope to digitize in support of this project. Additionally, state census records are also available every 10 years starting in 1825. Using both federal and state census records, you could theoretically track a family every 5 years, and sources of state census records could be Ancestry.com, Family Search, or the New York State Library. Another source of historical information being used to expand the project are photographs. Photos are digitized from the collections of the History Center with descriptive metadata added. The History Center received a grant for $3,000 from the South Central Regional Library Council in 2020 to help digitize building photographs to enhance HistoryForge records. And these photos will also be added to New York Heritage. Development work is being done to also allow user-generated content to be submitted. So if someone says, hey, that's my grandma, they have the opportunity to contribute a photograph of her to the record, in the website through a user intake form. Photographs and city directories are a great place to start, but HistoryForge can support other types of digitized content. There's a potential to include obituaries, newspaper articles, and even user-generated stories. Oral histories can also be linked in HistoryForge records. Apart from adding other types of historical content to HistoryForge, there are other areas where development is happening on the project. Currently, the project is focused on the city of Ithaca, but there is potential to expand to rural areas and surrounding towns in Tompkins County. HistoryForge is also looking to partner with other communities in New York State who are looking to start their own HistoryForge project, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. Development is happening as we speak to allow increased search functionality to be added to the user interface so that users can perform Boolean searches, wildcard searches, and spatial queries, such as distance and area. And finally, we're looking into ways to possibly link records using Library of Congress link data, GeoNames, DBpedia, and Wikidata. This is currently not part of the National Archives grant, but is something the project is looking towards for a future grant. And speaking of the National Archives grant, I just wanted to very briefly talk about what work on the project is currently being supported by that. The National Historical Public Records Commission, which is a branch of the National Archives and Records Administration, announced in 2019 the award of a public engagement with historic records grant to the History Center in support of HistoryForge. Many of these improvements are parts of the expanded project, which I just discussed, but I'd like to take a minute to focus on the exportability of the project and partnering. So HistoryForge is being developed this current year so that it can be adopted by any community. It doesn't have to be a history center. It could be another history center. It could also be a public library or even just a neighborhood that has enough interest that would want to adopt this model. There are two models for hosting. In the first model, HistoryForge duplicates their installation for Ithaca for the partner organization and customizes the installation and sets up cloud storage. This is almost a turnkey solution. The partner could begin transcribing and constructing map layers right away, but would need to just insert their information in the web page interface, add their own street conversion tables, and perhaps a few other things such as the digitized map and other content. They would have to pay for the one-time installation. That cost hasn't been sorted out yet, but they're thinking it'll be between $300 and $500. And ongoing hosting and storage expenses, which would be around $100 a month. This is a great solution for organizations that may not have the technological or financial resources to host their own instance of HistoryForge. But for those who do, there's also a second model. In this scenario, the partner sets up their own server any way they like, installs Linux, Ruby, PostgreSQL, and then installs both HistoryForge and MapWarper from GitHub. There will be detailed documentation and some consultation by the History Center, and the partner would control all the costs of installation and maintenance. They would then customize their own site. And that is the end of my presentation for HistoryForge. If anyone is interested in partnering or wants more information about the project, they can contact Bob or myself. And on that note, I would like to introduce Ben Smith.
Hello. Let me
Let me stop my share here. There we go.
That was super interesting. Thank you. The person record is super cool. Let me share my screen. Awesome. So yeah, my name is Ben Smith. I am one of the founders of Urban Archive, which is a technology nonprofit based out of New York City. And just going to be talking to you about making archives more accessible through data, design, and collaboration. And Urban Archive is made up of a number of partner organizations. 1 second. Sorry about that. I just had a little internet blip. Let me get this back up and running. So here we go. Where was I? So Urban Archive is made up of a number of partner organizations, all of which are based in New York City, and they all vary in size and scale. Some organizations have amazing archives to share. Others have amazing stories that could be told. And our mission is to extend the reach of these cultural organizations by providing them with collaborative tools to share local history. So when we started out Urban Archive about 4 years ago, we were looking at the different collection portals of some of our New York partners and thinking of ways that we could get these collections out in the open. And you know, our initial partners were the Museum of the City of New York, the Brooklyn Historical Society, and the New York Public Library. And when we started out, we thought, you know, the best way of actually getting these collections out in the open was trying to bring them to the street. And I think for me, I live and work in the Lower East Side. This is an intersection actually where I just dropped off my daughter this morning at Orchard and Hester. And it's a building that's full of, you know, amazing old tenement buildings of which I knew none of the stories of. And so, you know, this particular block has seen generations of history. And one of our goals is to get these stories out in the open. So just looking at one of the assets from our partner collections, this is actually the same intersection taken from Orchard and Hester in 1898. So you can see just the density of the street and just imagine all of the different interactions that have taken place over time. You know, one of the interesting bits, if we go back to the modern day shot, is that you can see a building back in the distance here called the Jarmolowski Bank Building. And it's the one with the little cupola detail on the top. And this building, you know, wasn't around in 1898. I think it was built in 1912. And a really beautiful building in the neighborhood. And one of our goals is, if we take these assets from all of the different partner institutions, you know, what kind of stories can we start to tell through these assets? And so just looking at that particular building and thinking about the different New York institutions where we could start to draw in digital assets, you can see photographs from New York Public Library, Museum of the City of New York. New York Times has written a number of articles about how there was a riot in front of the bank, about how the owner of the bank was put in prison and the bank was shut down. And ultimately the cupola was taken down and then restored. But one of the things that we need to do in order to get all of these digital assets on the map is find a framework or work with a geocoder that would allow us to pinpoint these locations. And thankfully, New York is a really progressive city with the way that it handles data. And they have, you know, 1,600 data sets as part of their open data portal. And one of those data sets is called Pluto, which is a borough block and lot information. So you can see on the background here, all of these purple blocks and lots These are all of the individual lots across the city, of which there are about 900,000 lots in New York. So a lot of lots where we can attach different bits of assets to. And the way that it works is we work with New York to bring in that data and then attach assets to it, which provides us with a lat-long coordinate through their geodata that they have associated with that. So by doing this, we enable organizations to geolocate their assets. They can easily share assets through the platform. We have an iOS and a web app. Our web app can be found at urbanarchive.org, and our iOS app, you could just search for Urban Archive to find that. And so we really want people to experience these assets as they're walking on the streets, and that's why we started out with the iOS app when we did. We also have Stripe integration for the different partners that are participating so that they can sell prints, and they take 99% of all of the income that's generated from that. And we have other fun API integrations that I'll talk about in a little bit. But like I said earlier, I think in New York alone, we have about 50 partners at this point, and the size and scale of the partners really varies dramatically. We have partners like Museum of the City of New York and New York Historical Society who have hundreds of thousands of records, and smaller institutions like Village Preservation or Museum of Chinese in America, which have very smaller collections, but they're more specific to a particular region. And so they can really shape the story and how they tell that. So one of the things that's interesting that we're doing is we're actually providing institutions with a way of having a profile page. So just like their Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram accounts, they have a profile page on Urban Archive that actually houses all of their information. And so we'll hope that they use that in the future as their handle. So the way that Urban Archive really works, much like some of the other projects that have been discussed today, is we bring in the digital assets and metadata into just a custom-built CMS that we've built for this project. And that CMS then actually manages all the sharing of information to our web app and our iOS app through an API that we've developed. And you can actually see that we also are using that same API to power our Link NYC integration, which I'll talk about in a minute. So what does this look like? Once we get these various assets at a particular location, we're providing users with the ability to view various assets from different organizations at that individual lot. So you can see here, this is the Chrysler Building, and I'm sure we have about 100 or so images of the Chrysler Building over time. And this is from the various partners that are involved in the project. So you can see in this feed, we have Museum of the City of New York, a lot of Museum of the City of New York, Library of Congress has one, and I'm sure many of our other partners in this feed have images as well. So if you click on one of those individual images, you are taken to additional metadata information and any additional content that they may have written on that particular location. And the same format is really done on our iOS app. So one of the things that we do allow institutions to do is to write stories so that they can group some of these things into something that is a little bit more shareable for their audience. A new feature which we've released fairly recently is the ability to show 3D buildings. And so we use Mapbox and OpenStreetMaps to pull in this data set. And so it just provides people with a little bit more context of the things that they're looking at on the screen. One of the fun features of our iOS app is if our users have location services on, then they can get pinged whenever they're near historic locations in the city and learn a little tidbit about that particular location. Users can also do photo recreations. So if you're on any of the individual assets in the app, you can click the little camera button, hold up the phone, and it does an overlay so that users can do a then and now recreation. And these templates are automatically created when the user takes that photo. So it stamps the original date from the metadata that we've extracted from the institution, and then adds today's date onto that template, and you can rearrange it much the way you can in Instagram or some of the other platforms. To do horizontal or vertical, it automatically adds the address of where you're taking that photograph and then shows the credit of the institution that's provided that image to the platform. So another fun thing that we've developed is what we're calling History Crush, which is the Tinder of historical content. So, you know, a lot of people can get, you know, stuck in their neighborhood in New York and look at all of the archives in that particular neighborhood, but there's so much history for people to learn across the city. So one interesting way of presenting this content is just presenting images that need to be, or just presenting images randomly and having users select whether or not they like that particular image. They can dive a little bit further into this and click into that location to see additional information if that image intrigues them. So it's just another way of surfacing this content so that, you know, there are more image views and more people can find that. I mentioned this a little bit earlier, and this is our Link NYC integration. So Link NYC, if you're not familiar, is this tower that's on the left-hand side of the screen. These are new Wi-Fi kiosks that are being installed across the city to replace existing phone booths. They provide people with high-speed internet, but then there's also advertising, and in our case, free advertising to educate people about the history of their surroundings. And the way that we're working with Link is we actually, this image here shows you all of the Link NYC kiosks on the left-hand side, and these are all the kiosk locations across the city. There are about 1,700 now, and this will be going up to about 7,500. And so this is actually another data set from the city of New York, just that they publish all of the lot long coordinates for all of these Link NYC kiosks. And because they do that, we're able to download all of those lot long coordinates, ingest that into our system, and then show relative, content that's near a particular kiosk on that particular screen. So this on the right-hand side is all of the, with all of the pink squares, is all of the assets that we've geolocated across the city on the lot information that we've been given. So just again, to explain that this is a particular kiosk. What we do in our software, we essentially draw a 200-meter radius around the lot long coordinates of that particular kiosk. And then we grab all of the images that are within 200 meters of that kiosk. And then we dynamically create templates, which are then displayed on these Link NYC terminals. So you can see in the bottom right-hand corner of each of these images, the institutions have been credited on there. It shows you how far you are from this particular image, shows you who the photographer was, the date, and then the address that's associated with it. And so Link NYC, all of these kiosks are updating every 30 minutes in New York. So as we're adding new assets to the platform and geolocating more things, then those Link kiosks are, you know, checking through our API whether or not there's additional content to show in that neighborhood or on that particular kiosk, and it will display that content in their queue. So this has been really awesome for us and for our partners. You know, on these roughly 1,800 kiosks, we're getting about 417 million annual impressions. So 417 eyes that are on these particular kiosks throughout the year. So it's just a ton of new exposure for these assets. Just another opportunity for them to be viewed by the general public. Another thing that we're doing is looking at white labeling the technology that we're producing. So, you know, this is on the left-hand side is urbanarchive.org, and this is the aggregate, all of our partners in one location. But we may have institutions that, or we do have institutions that want to have custom portals that just display their information and just their data. So we can create a custom domain on this particular instance, and we can actually just display their content and style it however the institution wants to style that particular template. So like I said, it allows them to do the custom branding, custom URL, filters just their stories and content, and allows them to connect to users. Another COVID story that has come out of this is Queens Public Library is actually using Urban Archive to collect stories from Queens residents during the COVID-19 pandemic. So residents can submit content through this platform, and then it's mapped across the borough of Queens for people to explore. And then ultimately, Queens can add this to their permanent collection going forward. So similar to HistoryForge, one of the things that we're actually currently looking to explore now is user profiles and giving people a handle, much like institutions have a handle on the platform, allowing people to share content that they may want to share, and providing the opportunity to share that with a larger audience as well. So this is showing a profile page for Museum of the City of New York on the left, and this is a profile page of me on the right. And two very different types of content. One thing that we're going to be super sensitive of is just having institutional content versus user content, and adding a moderation queue to user content. So for me as an individual, I can upload whatever I'd like to upload on my own personal page. That may not be visible from the map until it's gone through a moderation queue. So these particular images here are of me carrying a couch from 57th Street and 9th Avenue down to 27th and 6th. So this is like a fun story that I had when I was young in 2003. And not everyone's going to be interested in this story. So we wouldn't want the general public to be able to find this from the map, but I could share this out with my family and friends from my personal page. And then these images go through a queue. If they're a really special or meaningful image, then they could be added to the actual map layer of Urban Archive so that they're discoverable by anyone that's on the platform. So I think really what we're looking to do in the future is to get institutions and users to engage, collect, archive, share, and educate with their communities. And I think there's a lot of opportunities for us to do that with the different tools that we're building. And our goal is to just make our platform as good as possible for the institutions that we're trying to serve. And that is it for my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. This concludes the NYLA 2020 On-Demand Program, Historical Collections on the Digital Map. We hope you continue to take advantage of all the on-demand and live programs the NYLA 2020 Annual Virtual Conference has to offer. Thank you for helping us make this the best virtual conference ever. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.